Welcome to There She Is, the podcast by Women's Sport and Recreation Tasmania. This is a space for celebrating women in sport, the athletes, coaches, administrators, volunteers, and leaders who shape our sporting communities. We talk pathways, visibility, lived experience, and what works for women in sport right here in Tasmania and beyond. Because representation matters and every story deserves to be seen.
Hey everyone, it's Philippa here from Women's Sport and Recreation Tasmania, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Jauncey from the Devils, one of our new favourite sporting teams coming to Tasmania, and she is the General Manager for Strategy, People and Culture. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Philippa. I'm very, very excited to be here.
Amazing. Now, you grew up obviously a sporty girl, track, was it?
Yes.
Yep, runner. And you've been working a lot in corporate and more recently come back to the sporting space and working in that capacity. So tell us, what exactly is sport culture and strategy?
Yeah. So my role is strategy, people and culture. So really I look after all of what traditionally known as HR, which have been a big focus on recruitment, but also, anyone who works in the HR space will well know that that extends well beyond just recruitment. It extends into describing and defining the culture that we need to create in order to deliver on our strategy. And I guess that's where the strategy piece comes into play. So I lead the strategy development work for the Devils. So that's really looking at, where do we want to be in 12 months' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time as a club? And to me, you've got to have culture and strategy side by side. So, you've got to be able to define the direction of your club in our instance, but then also define, what is the right culture that we need in order to be able to deliver on that strategy. So I get to lead those two pieces of work, which is really an honour to do.
Yeah, I bet that's interesting because you've obviously got the daily implications or applications of that and then the long-term strategy. So what does it sort of look like a day in the life of your role?
Gosh, so varied. 1 minute I'm like right in the intricate details of setting up our payroll system because, we are a startup. So, then, having a conversation with our chairman on what the long-term strategy is going to be. So my day is incredibly varied. I'm building my own team within the club as well. So, there's mentoring and coaching of them. But it's really, being across everything in the club in many ways, because we are very much in that early days startup. There's so much going on. So, I'm quite often helping out in the retail shop out the front, or, having conversations with Brendan Gale, our CEO, about, internal membership and ticketing policies, for example.
Love it. Lots of diversity, which sounds super fun. Now, you've obviously in this great position here. Can you give us a bit of a background of how your career has evolved? Because I genuinely think sports women have really great transferable skills that can take you in sport and in other corporate environments and back and forth. So tell us a bit more about your journey.
Yeah. And look, I'll try and make it quick, although, I am 44 now, Philippa. So there's a few years that I've been working for, but certainly not a long time in sport. In fact, this role with the Devils, which I hit on 1 year tomorrow, in fact. So this role has really been my first full-time gig working in sport. Previous to this, I was on the board of the Jack Jumpers, so which I think was really the opportunity that encouraged me to want to get into sport full-time. So I was actually on my way back from Singapore. We'd been living in Singapore for a couple of years. I was working in a senior people and culture role at Amazon Web Services in Singapore, was moving back home to Tasmania. And I got the call up to see whether I'd be interested in being part of the inaugural board for the Jack Jumpers. And as well as obviously growing up running in athletics, as you described, I also played a lot of basketball. My parents were very involved in basketball. So I know the sport of basketball reasonably well. And so I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to be involved in the Tasmania Jack Jumpers. And so you jumped on that board and very quickly learned the power of sport from an inclusion perspective. And so, the fact that the Jack Jumpers were able to bring the whole of Tasmania together. And, I often share that the story of, when you walk inside My State Bank Arena and you sit down and it doesn't matter where the person next to you is from, what religion they are, what cultural identity they are. It doesn't matter if they've got the Jack Jumper scarf on, then, they are one of you. And so, to me, I think with my background in diversity and inclusion in corporates, this has really helped me to understand the power of sport. And so it was through those experiences as a board director, I thought, you know what, I actually want to work full time in sport. And, fortunately for me, the Devils came to town and I was able to connect in with Brendan Gale, and we had some wonderful early conversations, and this role sort of emerged. But I guess going back even earlier, I really started my career in the space of people and culture, HR, leadership development. I've worked in consulting firms, so worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers for a number of years. I've also worked in big corporates like Australia Post, Amazon Web Services, and I've also run my own business as well. So I've had a very diverse career. All of those experiences, I think, have helped me, particularly in my first year here at the Devils, to bring, I think, a diversity of thinking to this job. I think it's actually a benefit that I haven't worked in the AFL industry before. We've got plenty of people in the club who have, but I come with a different perspective, and we've got a blank canvas here, right? So we want to bring those diverse perspectives to the table.
I love it. I love it. So you are really passionate about advocacy for women, especially in the workplace. We know about the gender pay gap. Was there a pivotal moment for you in your career where you had some really impactful change there?
Yeah, so I probably cast my mind back to when I was at Australia Post, and at that point, I was still involved in athletics, still competing in athletics. And I remember going along to compete at the Stall Gift for the first time. And I recall looking at the prize money at the Stall Gift, and it was quite disturbing, to be frank. So, the men's prize pool for the men's gift race, the sprinting race. And for those who don't know the Stall Gift, it's one of the richest running races in Australia, and has been for many, many decades. But when I looked at the program, it had the men's prize pool was 60,000, the women's prize pool was 6,000. So, I found that to be quite alarming. But, when I dug into it a bit more, that was the reality of the situation. And look, not uncommon, I don't think, when you look at prize money or even just pay across women's sport more generally. But what was fascinating was, as I was talking to one of my best friends on this topic, and we were basically complaining about the disparity, and she said, well, who is the major sponsor of the Stall Gift? And it just so happened to be Australia Post, the company who I was working for at the time. So I did sort of take it upon myself to go, right, if anyone can make a change here, then, it could be me, and it should be us as Australia Post. Australia Post are very much leaders in the diversity and inclusion space, and have been for many years. And so I was able to, through a lot of different conversations, able to help influence and convince Australia Post to pull out of the headline sponsorship and actually become the sponsor of the women's race, so that it was equal prize money to the men's. And I believe to this day that is still the case. Australia Post have stepped out completely now, but the current setup is that the men's and women's races are paid the same in terms of prize money. And so I guess that was a real aha moment for me to go, well, you know what? If you do see disparity, you can step into it, particularly if you've got the right connections. And so you've got to use those connections and be bold in putting yourself forward. And so I'd say, to this day, I still feel like that's one of my proudest career moments. Was I actually got the opportunity to hand the check over to the winner of one of the women's races, and, just to see the joy on her face, but also to see the uptick in terms of participants was really inspiring.
That's incredible. Now, you were particularly young when this happened. So what kind of gave you the confidence to do that? Or were you already sort of feeling confident? And what would you say to anyone of any age who sees that disparity and how they approach these conversations with those key decision makers?
Yeah, look, I think you've got to listen to that fire in your belly. Like, that was one of those moments where I was genuinely angry. I was like, this just isn't right. This can't be right. And we all know that feeling, that feeling deep inside when you just go, nah, this doesn't sit well with me. And I think we've got to listen to those feelings. And so I really let those feelings fuel my my conversations. And I do recall, as part of that, I drafted an email that I wanted to send to the CEO. And I ran it by my manager and he was like, well, I'm not sure if you should send that. And I said, I really want to. And he said, well, it's up to you. And I did. And, if I hadn't have, then, I may not have influenced the change that ended up happening. So I do think you've got to be bold. I mean, respectfully bold. And that's an important piece. But I guess when I consider these sorts of opportunities, I always think about, well, what if I don't do anything? What might happen then? And for me, in that instance, it was like, well, if I don't do anything, nothing's going to change. And I couldn't live with that. So I needed to give it a good crack and surround yourself with, people who will support and encourage you as well. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, there's a lot of passionate people in sport, especially as well. So yeah, if you combine and use those powers for good, then you can have a huge impact for sure.
Yeah, agree.
Now, coming from that sort of HR background and thinking of girls who might be passionate about sport who are corporate or vice versa, do you have any sort of advice for people in that space or how they could recognise how these skills cross over into different industries?
Well, I think as I described my diverse career, I think having people of all sorts of different backgrounds is really valuable, well, for any business, but, I'm speaking on behalf of, AFL Clubland. I think it's really important that we bring in, different people, different voices. I think the key is to think deeply about, well, what are the experiences that I have? What is the value that I could bring to a sporting club environment if you haven't got that sports background? And when I think about my initial conversations with Brendan before I started in my role, I was very open to say, look, I have never worked in AFL. In fact, I've never worked in the sports industry. I probably couldn't even name 5 or 6 AFL players off the top of my head. But I think what I can bring is deep experience in how you define and create the right culture, how you define the core purpose of your club, how you define the core values of your club and help establish them really early on, as well as I'd done a fair bit of work in the strategy consulting space in the previous sort of 3 or 4 years. And so I also knew that, the club being such an early startup probably wouldn't have had that time to think through their longer term strategy. So the other piece of my proposal was to say, yes, I can set up the people and culture foundations and systems and processes. And that's my bread and butter. I've done that before. And I can also help you to pull the strategy together. And my value add in that space is not being an expert in football, but actually I can pull out the right insights from the right stakeholders at the right time and craft that into a really engaging story. So I think for me, my approach has always been, well, what is my really add? And then learning a bit about, well, where is this club? Where is this organisation at? And how can I kind of pitch myself in a way which is going to basically leave them going, well, I can't say no because I need this skill set and I need this kind of person right now.
Love it. Great tips. And a lot of people who work in the sports space are often volunteers. So if they're working, volunteer capacity, working full time, and they can see that culture does need a bit of a shift in their club, for example, do you have sort of one tip or thing that they should focus on that would start to have an impact for them?
Yeah, look, I do think being really clear on what your culture is or what you want your culture to be and what your culture actually is. So I guess for more established clubs, and as a volunteer, I think you can provide some really important insights into what the culture actually is. And so I think it's probably finding, the right individuals, the right trusted individuals who may be working within the club to give them that feedback. I find it incredibly valuable getting feedback from people, both within and external to the club in terms of, well, how is our culture perceived? The connection between brand and culture now is so intertwined that I think that's a really, really important piece. I'd say providing feedback to the club and making sure that you're providing that in a really respectful and constructive way. What you don't want to do is come across as being, the one complaining about stuff. So, what are the great things about the culture that you've experienced? And then what are the things that you see the club might be able to do to improve itself from a volunteer perspective?
I've been hearing this a lot lately from a lot of other people by coming forward with other ideas and options, so not just that complaining piece, but ideas you've thought through and obviously that can be expanded on and elaborated are going to be much more well received
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
just
No. Yeah.
I'm cross.
Yeah, definitely. And I say that to my team members all the time. I'm like, yeah, look, I'm always happy to be a sounding board and throw around ideas, or if you've got problems, let's talk them through. But I do want you to think about, what do you think a solution might be? Let's not just come to the table with the problem. Let's at least have had some time to think through what might be the solution. So I think that's a really important point, Philippa, to encourage people to come with an idea or a solution.
Yeah. Love it. Now, obviously, you're still passionate about advocacy and inclusion and diversity, and you're going to Canberra now and you're on a particular board that covers this. Can you tell us more about that role and the impact that that's set out to have?
Yeah, so Sports Integrity Australia have pulled together a diversity and inclusion committee. And so it's quite early, so we've only had a couple of meetings and we meet on a quarterly basis. But really the purpose is to bring together, diverse leaders from right across the country, different sports, very different backgrounds, to be a bit of a sounding board for Sports Integrity Australia, to test ideas, to help them with their longer term strategy. And look, as I said, it's early days. So, we're working through exactly what that charter looks like and what our core purpose is. But I just, from a personal perspective, I've got to surround myself with some incredible humans, and one in particular, there's an individual on that committee who actually came down and ran a session with us on LGBTIQ plus inclusion with the team and took us through this amazing immersion experience. And so already I'm personally getting a lot of benefit from being part of that committee. But I think it's wonderful that, our governing bodies like Sports Integrity Australia are thinking deeply about, getting diverse people around the table to provide that support and advice.
Do you have like a particular passion or outcome that you'd like to see from the work that you're doing there?
Well, I mean, I'm really excited by the fact that we are, we're in startup phase, right, as a football club. And so we can build these equitable, inclusive, diverse foundations into our club right now. And so that's where I'm really leaning into this committee to find out, okay, well, what are you doing in the rugby industry? What are you doing, in the world of swimming? What are you doing in all these different areas that I can kind of pluck out and apply so early and set those foundations? Because I often say we've got this opportunity here, but it's also quite a big responsibility. Like, we can get this right, and we should get this right from day one. And so being able to share thoughts and ideas and sit around a table with people who have lived through, some of these challenges and can provide me advice and tips on, how I can potentially set us up in a way whereby we're going to avoid some of those challenges or position us really well to be as inclusive as possible.
Right. And one of the other most important roles you have as well is you're a mum of 3. And so how did you find, having children, still working on your career at that point, how did you balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do 3 daughters, 15, Milla's 15, Frankie's 13 and Lily's 10. So, we're through the early toddler crazy phase. And, they're all young, independent ladies now, and all very, very passionate and involved in sport, which I love. But any sporting parents out there will no doubt appreciate the running around that is involved when your kids are in that age of making rep teams and then wanting to still do multiple sports. It is chaotic. There's no doubt about that. Look, my husband and I have very much taken a shared load approach. And, to be frank, he's sort of stepped back from his career, in the last sort of 10 years to take more of that primary carer responsibility. And that's a decision that we made together. I've probably always been the more career oriented. And so I've sort of stepped in and lent more into my career. And he's been quite willing and comfortable and happy to take on more of those caring responsibilities. So in fact, it's only been in the last 6 months that he's gone back into full-time work. And so that in itself has been interesting in terms of juggling it. So I'd have to say, it takes a village. And so that's one of the reasons why we moved back to Tasmania. We had 11 years in Melbourne. couple of years in Singapore, but we've come back to Tasmania because we do have family support around us. My mum and stepdad and my husband's parents are very involved in our kids' lives and do run a taxi service for us. There's no doubt about that. I think just having those really frank conversations, with those close to you to work out how you're going to structure yourselves. And that's always worked, really, really well for us. But yeah, I do think I think particularly as a mum, you do need to make conscious decisions in your career about what is the right role for you at the right time. And I've said quite openly to a few staff members here that there would have been certain times in my life that this role would not have been right for me because it is very fast paced. It can be long hours. But at the moment, in terms of where my kids are at, I feel like I can put that effort and energy in. Maybe, 10 years ago when I had, three kids under 5, I'm not sure that this quite would have been the right environment for me. So, I think you do have to make those choices. And you often hear that saying of you can have everything, just not at the same time. And I've certainly felt that through my career. But I'd have to say right now, I feel like I've landed in, my dream job and I get a lot of energy from the work that I do, and I feel like my family, my girls, get to feel the benefits of that. When I'm at home spending time with them.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Sounds like you've found a really great balance. And I can attest to the ebbs and flows and phases of life where things start to fit in or don't. Now, remember when I was last down there and Kath was there too, and she said lots of people are returning to Tasmania, I guess for similar reasons. So are you getting a lot of Tasmanians returning back to Hobart and working with the Devils?
Yeah, we are. And I love that about this club, that we are often, the catalyst for people to come home. The amount of people who I've had apply for jobs who have said this is the job that would get me back home, and we love that. And I've been quite open in saying too, I'll definitely bias Tasmanians because we are a Tasmanian club, and if I'm in a position where I've got 2 candidates and we're trying to pick between them, and one's got Tasmanian backgrounds and roots and the other doesn't, I'm going to pick the Tasmanian. So. I think that's a beautiful story, and I think that's the power of the club and that power of that sense of belonging, that people are attracted to being part of this growth journey and are willing to come back home to our beautiful state to be part of it.
So exciting. So if you're not back in Tasmania, this may be the calling card to come back home.
Absolutely.
And just to finish off, Lauren, what makes you most excited about the future of sport for women and girls?
Oh, I just think we are on a wave right now. I mean, I watched the Matildas last night and I couldn't help but just sit there and reflect on the amazing journey that they've been through and the role that they've played in really, I think, elevating women's sport. As I mentioned, I've got 3 daughters, and the fact that they are growing up in a world where they can see really clear pathway. I didn't get the opportunity to play AFL. It just wasn't an option. So I didn't really get an opportunity to play soccer. There might have been a little bit played, but not really for girls. And so to me, the fact that our daughters, our girls can see those pathways and can actually have a career in playing, but also being administrators in sport too, and just the health benefits and the data that we're seeing around that women who are in senior positions have often participated in sport at a relatively high level, and so keeping girls in sport as well. I just think from a mental health perspective, from a physical perspective, from a body image perspective is really powerful and really exciting. And the fact that we get to work in that space and we get to build a club that is focused on equity, and I hope that you can see that in our socials and so forth. We profile our women, our female players as much as our men. We're building our training and administration facility in an equitable way. So, the women's change rooms aren't tacked on, like they are front and centre. I'd arguably say the women's are a little bit nicer than the men's, but, don't tell anyone that. But, this is the opportunity that we've got to build this well from the beginning and just pave the way for our daughters and young girls to be what they want to be.
Well, thank you so much for the incredible work that you're doing and advocating for women and girls in sports and diversity in the workplace. It's having a huge impact on our little part of the world. So by all means, go and support the Devils. Keep an eye out. There's so many more jobs that are coming out, and you might get to work with awesome people like Lauren and the incredible culture that they're building at the Devils. So thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Philippa. That's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.
If this episode resonated with you, if you believe in visibility, representation, and strong pathways for women in sport, we invite you to join us. Women's Sport and Recreation Tasmania is a growing community of state sporting bodies, clubs, women, and allies working together to make sport more inclusive, connected, and supportive across our state. By becoming a WSRT member, you're helping amplify women's voices, stories, and leadership, both on the field and behind the scenes. Head to wsrt.org.au/membership to learn more about becoming a member, because when we can see women in sport, we can be them.